welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and for those of you who are new to this show, I'm an African-centered talk show whose purpose is to correct errors where errors are found and to introduce facts where we find that people are still working on fiction when it comes to who we are as African people and an ancient people. What I'm doing with this show is part two of a segment that I started last week on great African thinkers. I've been doing this series for a couple of months now. In previous shows, I've talked about people like Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, especially on the last show, the last series, one of the great African thinkers. And on this show, starting last time, I started to talk about somebody that many of you have never most likely heard of, but had a great impactful assertions about who we were and who we are as African people. And I'm talking about this man here. His image will come up in a minute. And this is what he said at a symposium in one of his core theses actually the 20th century. Ancient Egyptian was Negro civilization. He's talking like that from the 60s. The history of black Africa will remain suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until African historians dare to connect it with the history of Egypt. And that is a powerful statement if you understand where he's coming from. He was a multi-genius, and in fact, he got an award in 1966 that him and W.E.B. Du Bois got an award that said that he was considered one of the greatest African minds and had the greatest impact on people of African descent by his research. He was a physicist, he was a Egyptologist, and other history, but he focused on Egyptology. He was a mathematician. His first degree was in philosophy. He was a great anthropologist, archaeologist. Yeah, that's a picture of that younger version of him. He has a college today. He was born in 1923. And that image right there is the image of his carbon dating lab, you know, where you can detect the age of organic subjects. He created that by himself, became the first director of that lab. That lab still exists. He has been honored. You see him there with Andrew Young when he was mayor of Atlanta. When he came to Atlanta, I think that was in either 1985 or 1986. He died in 1986, February, so that was a couple of months before he passed at the age of 61. Actually, he was teaching a class when he collapsed. But he was treated in that picture during that time. He was going to make a speech at Morehouse College there in Atlanta. He was treated as a government dignitary from Senegal. Okay, he had police escorts. They had all kinds of ceremonies to honor him. He's considered one of the greatest African minds in the 20th century, yet many people of African descent never heard of him. But you'll hear about Einstein, and I'm not knocking Einstein. He deserves all the accolades that he gets. But we people of African descent have great scholars who has proven, and only in the last 20 or 30 years have been proven correctly, that first of all, that the oldest human beings, according to the Leakeys, were Africans. The oldest civilizations that came into being was on the continent of Africa. And one of the greatest civilizations that ever existed that still attracted millions and millions and millions of people every year to the country of Egypt today is the temples and places of the Egyptian society that many people wanted to claim. But my point is to show that his book, The African Origin of Civilization, this is where many people, many African Americans came in contact with Sheikh Anta Diop, like myself, by reading this book. And you know, I could walk around after reading this. In fact, I'm rereading it. It came out, I think, in the 1970s. It was written in French, and then it got translated into English, I think, in the 80s after his death, right, 88 or so. But by Ivan van Sertima. I talked about Einstein. Now, Einstein is famous for one of his theories, Einstein's theories of relativity. When that came out, not too many people know that most of the scientists of the time in the early 1900s didn't even understand a word of it, couldn't even figure it out, majority of them. You know, that it took him many years after the theory, before he got the Nobel Prize in physics for that great theory, and you know, and people started slowly understanding it. But it took some people decades. Dr. Diop translated Einstein's theory of relativity into his country's major language system, which is Wolof. The Wolof language is, the Wolof people are found in Senegal. He translated this difficult thesis into another African language. That's how brilliant this person was. I forget to add that he was also a great linguist. So he spoke multiple languages, and he studied languages. And where I left off last time was I was talking about, even with all these accolades that he got, you know, in the 50s, France, where he worked, he got his education in the Sorbonne, which was the MIT of France. You know, like we have MIT and Harvard, or you have the Rhodes Scholars at Oxford in England. Well, the Sorbonne is like all those colleges, but for the French, and as part of the Senegal was a colony of France during the time of his birth in 1923 or 24, in the 1920s. I know he died. He died in February of 1986. But he worked at the lab of one of the Curies. You know, Madame Curie, her son-in-law opened a prestigious physics lab, and because of his brilliance in math and chemistry, he was a chemist also, great chemist, he was hired to work in that lab for many years. And with all those accolades, he still focused on who we were as people of African descent. He put on his archaeological hat. He put on his anthropological hat. He put on the data of carbon dating in his physics hat, chemistry hat. In fact, one of his greatest achievements, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, that he brought to this symposium that I also talked about, that I left off in the last show, which came about which was put together by UNESCO. And for those of you who do not know what UNESCO is, it's the United Nations Economic, Scientific, and Cultural Commission, okay? Which goes around the world. You hear about the UNESCO sites that they have, which they preserve ancient structures, and you know, you're considered untouchable if you're deemed a UNESCO historical site. Okay, they put together a symposium in Cairo, Egypt in 1974. And the topic of that, what was attached to the letter, was for all the great Egyptologists, archaeologists, linguistic people, all these great scholars who are top in their fields at that time, was to bring evidence, and then they would, for a couple of days, come to a consensus of whether the Egyptians were black. Why that was a big deal? Well, there's a picture of an individual, I think his name is Blumenbach. This gentleman right here, okay? And the next, he lived around the near the late 1700s. And he was the one who came up with the term Caucasian. Okay, he came. I've got this out of another great book, a good starter book for those of you who might be interested. It's called Nile Valley Civilization by Brother Anthony Browder. It's been around for 20 or more years, and it's a great read. And in the introduction of that book, on page 19, I found this statement. Between 1775 and 1800s, the Göttingen University, that's where Blumenbach was a professor, okay? And he put his works out in 1775. This university established the concept, based on his writing, the science of antiquities. In other words, that then became what we all know as Egyptology and, and archaeology, those type of sciences. And upon which future universities would build. Okay, this is the early time when archaeology and anthropology and linguistics were the rave. And this theory, according to what you read there, lasted for 200 years until the time of Sheikh Anta Diop. And the fact that he and most of the mythology of white supremacy that you even still hear today by some extreme groups, and sometimes coming out of the White House today in the year 2019, this concept of the beautiful Western world, that everything came out of the West. All civilizations got their start from studying the Greeks, being spread by the Romans, and all the things that Europe had. And this theory came out of Blumenbach. Now, Blumenbach was a professor. He came up with a theory that was written, and the university, and this German university, established a discipline that was copied by other universities throughout Europe, and it was based on pseudoscience. The word Caucasian came from the people, which is now modern day Georgia, which was once part of the Soviet Union, and he thought that the Georgians were beautiful. They were white people. I don't know. And from that, he came up with this concept of great whiteness, and he came up with these categories. He put the Caucasians on top, of course, and he separated, the blacks, or the Negroes, as they were called at the time, and they were always at the bottom of the civilized world. They were the less developed. They didn't have thought process. If you start reading many different writings of historical people, even here in America, who always say that of the two, the white race is better, as Abraham Lincoln said in one of his speeches. I'm not going to quote the whole speech here because I got a little bit limited time, but you could look up at some of his, or in one of his speeches in Cairo, Illinois, when he was following Douglas around to debate him before he became president, when he was going for a seat in the Senate against Douglas, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He said certain things. There were many of the books that were given to students, whether from grade school on up, had the concept that showed that Europe was the fountainhead of everything. And Blumenbach claimed that the Egyptians were white. okay? So this was the entrenched kind of thinking that went about uh, and Europe and the world, that it was established here in America even to justify, and this is my thoughts, and you know, to justify why we enslaved people. And slavery had an economic origin. You know, when all these countries started going out and, you know, exploring the world, once they came out of the Renaissance, after they kicked out the last of the Moors in Spain in 1492, and they had access to the oceans, and Columbus supposedly discovered America, and that's another story that I talked about it in the previous show about with Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. They had to justify their actions for the transatlantic slave trade. And this Blumenbach theory that's been around for about 100 years, you know, afterwards justified that, you know, justified those history books of the 1700s, the late 1700s, the 1800s, well into the 1900s, to justify and teach kids coming up who become the adults who had kids, generation and generation and generation perpetuated this. And when you have ideas that are coming out in the last 30 years that contradict that, they call it, you know, African-centeredness. That's what we're talking about, who has been proven when we say that black people were the ancient people. Okay, we just weren't discovered by Europe in 1619 or 1500s when they started kidnapping us from Western Africa and bringing us over and spreading us out through Europe, through the North and South America, and on throughout the Caribbean. They had to justify that. And why? Okay, the people who started in this newly founded discipline called Egypt, that developed the Egyptology and archaeology. I want to go to the next slide, and is Francois Champollion. I don't know if I pronounced it right, but he's the one who broke the code for the hieroglyphics. Before him, and you can, in 1822, he broke the code. He actually went to Egypt in 1828, but sadly he died in 1832, 10 years later. He was struggling, he was poor, he was focused on breaking the code, and he used this object that's coming up next, and that's what's called the Rosetta Stone. That was found in 1799 in the village in Egypt by soldiers who were digging entrenchments, and they found this large 2-foot by 7-ton, a couple of ton stone. That on the top you see hieroglyphics. In the middle you see what they call demotic, not demonic, demotic, which was the language of the common folks. Only the priests spoke in the divine language of the gods, which is hieroglyphics. And at the bottom is classical Greek, ancient Greek, spoken by the pharaoh, the king at that time, Philadelphus, who was one of the descendants of the Greeks. And he's an ancestor of Cleopatra. The Ptolemies were their name. But I want to end with this statement here by Sheikh Anta Diop, and one of the things that he did at the symposium that blew everybody who was there out of the water. All these experts in archaeology and anthropology and physics who came to determine whether the Africans were Egyptians, were black. And what they came about was that they were. That was based on what Sheikh Anta Diop and Obenga did. Of the two the two Africans were the only one who came prepared to prove their point. All the others were using the same nonsensical theories that went all the way back to Blumenbach. They scientifically showed, in fact, Sheikh Anta Diop used 11 different principles, disciplines, and I'm talking about linguistics, archaeology, anthropology, all these other chemistry. And one of the things, chemist-wise, he proved that was the icing on the cake and put a lid on that nonsense of the Egyptians being white or some culture close to white that never existed. He did something called the melanin dosage test. And what you do is take a piece of skin from the mummy or the cot, as the ancients called it. Mummy is what Europeans call that, that wrapped body, and you would put it in a chemical that would make it fluorescent and crystallize. And you can literally count each melanin crystal to see the amount of melanin within the skin. If there's a lot of melanin, like somebody look like me, or some of you, or Sheikh Anta Diop there would be a large melanin count, a large count. If there was somebody, if they were white, like they were told, we've been told for hundreds of years by these Europeans, they would have almost no melanin, which would make them white, like they're told. He did experiment on a number of these mummies, and yes, they had high melanin count. So there is a way, and this was in 1974. We're in 2019, and we're still having arguments about, whether the Egyptians were black. This brother, based on what I've told you, blew the lid off that lie. I'm gonna show you a series of, go to the next one, and the next one. What you're looking at is temples in Egypt, these great temples. And everybody wanted to claim what you see in front of you. So Blumenbach and those professors that followed him want very much, because a lot of the things that you see in Egypt to this very day, it will blow your mind, and people will wonder, how did they do this? How did they build these structures, like the pyramids, like these great temples, like all the things that culture produced 5, 6, 7,000 years ago? But a lot of before Champollion did what he did and broke the code, they could just look at these things, but they couldn't read the writing on the wall. He opened up the mind of the Egyptian, and everybody wanted to claim their mind. They had scrolls that go back 4,000 or 5,000 years that talked about things that you find in medical books today, way before Herodotus. And Sheikh Anta Diop showed in that symposium that those people who did all that look like me and look like many of you out there who's looking at this. Let's go on further, Now, he was not the only one, and I'm talking about Sheikh Anta Diop, was not the only one that claimed that the Egyptians was black. This is Herodotus. He is considered the father of history. He was a Greek, who went to Egypt in 450 BCE. And according to most translations, Herodotus states that a Greek oracle was known to be from Egypt because she was black, and the natives of the Nile regions are black with heat, and that Egyptians were black-skinned with woolly hair. He walked among them, okay? But people like Blumenbach and those who came after him in those as Egyptologists and anthropologists and ignored that truth. Yet we are told when we go to school, Herodotus is the father of history, except when he talks about the black people, Egyptians that he walks amongst. And let's move on to the next. I just kind of put that one up there to show that, you know, I'm just not the person who talked the talk. I walked the walk. I was there myself and looked at all those great monuments that put awe in everybody who's gone down there, going to Napoleon, going to Caesar, going to Alexander, who copied the culture of Egypt. If the Greeks were the fountainhead of Western civilization, why didn't they change the Egyptians to follow their culture? Alexander the Great, so-called great, and all the people, the Greeks who came before him for 200 or 300 years until the Romans took over through Julius Caesar, they copied what they saw of the Egyptians. They were influenced. You know, Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemies, which descend from one of the generals who took over Egypt and became a pharaoh himself and changed his name to Ptolemy. And his family ended up with Cleopatra, and then the Romans took over under Julius Caesar, and that mess you read in Shakespeare about what happened between her and him. And let's move on to the next slide. I also talked about Herodotus, who was a Greek. These are Greek vases found. You can find this vase in, I forgot what museum in Europe, but if you see that person in the middle, the Greeks themselves said that they got all their knowledge from the Egyptians, that the Egyptians were black in their writing. How come you don't know about that when you go to college to this day? This vase in the middle is another black person called Memnon, okay? And his departure for Troy. In the Iliad, the Trojan War, Memnon is one of the characters. He was a king, okay? And it says at the bottom, was an Ethiopian king. The Greeks wrote that. Yet how many of you have heard those things? This is found in the Royal, and this is a sculpture sculpted in Rome in 160 AD. And that is the image that they sculpted of Memnon, one of the characters that Homer talked about in the Iliad, the Trojan Wars. How come we don't know about that? How come anything that has to do with us in antiquity throughout human history is not in our consciousness, not in the natural way that we think? We know about, again, Einstein. We know about Julius Caesar. We know about Shakespeare and all these European histories, but we're still cut off from the history of who we are. I don't know how many slides we have next because we're running short on time. This is Volney, who wrote a book in 1800s, and this is what he says when he went to Egypt in the 1880s. And this should be the last one before I close. He said that this race of black men today are our slaves, and the objects of our scorn is the very race which we owe our art, science, and even the use of speech. He said that in 1787 after seeing the Sphinx. So until next time, peace, Hotep, bye-bye.